Only in America.
Only in America.
Only in America.
Only in America.
Only America.
Only in America.
Welcome to Only in America. I'm Ali Noorani. This week, empathy. How can we be more empathetic in our conversations? How can we be more empathetic in our public policy? Our guest this week is my friend, author, and advocate, Belinda Bauman, who introduces us to Esperance, a Congolese woman whose shocking story opened her eyes.
She generously brought me her story and then gave it to me and said, do something with this. For me, that translated as a white evangelical woman into the voice of God. Belinda, you have just received a mandate from your teacher. Tell this story and figure out what this story means to changing the world, because something's wrong.
And Belinda shares why she is optimistic about our future.
I'm really hopeful for this amazing demographic that seems to be emerging, which is Christian women of faith who are really ready to move beyond. They're ready to have that really tense, brave conversation about immigration reform.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Noorani. Since 2011, the informal motto of the National Immigration Forum has been to meet people where they are, but don't leave them there. To do this successfully, whether or not we realized it, requires a high level of empathy, that we put ourselves in another person's shoes to understand how they see the issue of immigration. But not that we just understand why someone feels the way they do, but that we understand the circumstances of that feeling. What is the broader context of someone's life? How does that context impact their perception of immigration? It wasn't too long ago that a United States senator that would go on to be president centered his politics on empathy. In 2007, Oprah Winfrey and then Senator Barack Obama talked about his creed, taught to him by his mother.
She taught me empathy, the basic concept of standing in somebody else's shoes and looking through their eyes. And she, if I did something messed up, she'd just say, how would that make you feel if somebody did that to you? Mm-hmm. And that ends up being, I think, at the center of my politics. And I think that should be the center of all our politics. If we see a child who's languishing in an inner city school, how would we feel if that was our child?
My guest this week, author and advocate Belinda Bauman, told me about Roman Krznaric, an empathy guru. In 2013, Roman presented a TED Talk on empathy in Athens, titled How to Start an Empathy Revolution. In his talk, Roman listed 8 ideas that he said could ignite a global empathy revolution.
We live in an age of hyper-individualism, an era in which an overdose of free market culture and simplistic self-help have led us to believe that the best way to lead the good life and achieve human happiness is to pursue our narrow self-interest, to follow our personal desires. In a way, the question, what's in it for me, has become the leading question of our time. And I believe we urgently need an antidote. And that antidote is empathy. But what is empathy? Empathy is the art of stepping into the shoes of another person and looking at the world from their perspective. It's about understanding the thoughts, the feelings, the ideas and experiences that make up their view of the world. It's about understanding where another person is really coming from. Now, we all know that empathy makes a difference in our everyday relationships. You've probably had experiences where you've been arguing with your partner or your husband or your wife, and you thought to yourself, oh, I wish they just understood my point of view. I wish they understood what I was feeling. What are you asking for there? Empathy, of course, right? But empathy can do more than help in our relationships. Empathy can create radical social change. Empathy, I believe, can create a revolution. Not one of those, old-fashioned revolutions of new laws and institutions, public policies, but a revolution of human relationships. And we urgently need this revolution because of a growing global empathy deficit. In the United States, for example, empathy levels have declined by nearly 50% over the last 40 years. The steepest decline has been in the last 10 years. At the same time, we have worldwide growing social divides. In 2/3 of Western countries, the gap between rich and poor is greater today than it was in 1980. At the same time, over 1 billion people in the world are living on less than $1 a day. Everywhere we turn, we see the conflicts caused by religious fundamentalism, ethnic tensions, and anti-immigrant sentiments. We urgently need empathy to create the social glue to hold our societies together and to erode the toxic us versus them mentality that is the cause of so much conflict. Now, there's good news, which is that 98% of us, say the neuroscientists, have the ability to empathize and step into somebody else's shoes. Our brains are wired for empathy. We are Homo empathicus. But very few of us have really reached our full empathic potential. And as a society, we haven't yet really learned to harness the power of empathy to create social and political transformation.
Roman is a prolific advocate of empathy. He wrote the 2014 book, Empathy, Why It Matters and How to Get It. He's launched the online empathy library, where you can find examples of empathy in books, speeches, and films. He also is behind a traveling empathy museum, where visitors can enter life-size shoeboxes and emerge wearing other people's shoes, which I imagine can be quite the tricky walk.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the James Irvine Foundation, expanding opportunity for the people of California, and from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding.
So this is episode number 78 of Only in America, and in each episode I've had the privilege of speaking with people from all walks of life. One person I've always wanted to interview is Belinda Bauman. Now, I've known Belinda and her husband Stephen for several years. In various capacities, they've been supporters of our work, partners in new efforts, and along the way, two of my dear friends. From afar, I always found Belinda's work incredibly inspiring. She would travel the world, helping resettle refugees, shining a light on women who are victims of terrible violence, lifting the voices of the powerless. While I found her work inspiring, I never had a chance to understand what inspired her, which is why Belinda's new book, Brave Souls: Experiencing the Audacious Power of Empathy, is so important. She takes the time and does the painstaking work to tell us about her journey to learn more about empathy, a journey that began while she was revisiting the Democratic Republic of Congo. There she met a woman named Esperance, which means hope. For many reasons, graphic and emotional, this is a difficult conversation to hear, but it is an important one. You have traveled the world, you've done an incredible amount of incredibly courageous things, and I feel like we could have an entire conversation just on, how you find yourself here today, right? So give me the one moment in your worldly travels where you realize that, okay, what I am doing is important.
I don't think my one moment, well, maybe everybody's one moment isn't typical, right? It's hard to nail your one moment to the wall. But for me, it is. I wrote an entire book about it, actually. It was the moment that I learned that there really is a love that exists in this world that is strong enough to actually change things. And I learned about that love from a woman named Hope. Her name is Esperance. She lives in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is an incredibly resource-rich but conflict-riddled cauldron, and considered by many, even now, being labeled as post-conflict. She was living there as a pre-literate woman under the poverty line with 4 children and a husband, and her village was attacked by a rebel group interested in winning a war over the issue of breaking bodies of women. They caught her and her husband. They shot Esperance's husband, and as they did so, her hands flew to her head in this kind of universal sign of abandonment of I have been forsaken. And they took her, raped her, brutalized her for 3 hours, left her abandoned in the Virunga National Forest, where she spent 3 days, unable to move, unable to cry out, in and out of consciousness. And as she lay there, she herself was reckoning with, will someone come and save me? She was rescued. She was saved by sisters like her, Congolese women that had been sent out to scavenge, look for, find the women who were experiencing rape and abandonment at the hand of militia or military. These sisters were sent out by their local churches, by pastors who knew what was happening and decided not to turn a blind eye, but actually train those that would be sensitive enough to that kind of experience to go find these women. So, as survivors of rape, women in the churches were trained and then went and found their sisters in the forest. Esperance was found. She was fed, clothed, taken care of. These women sat with her through 1 full month of rape treatment, and then they spent 9 months working with her because she decided to keep the baby named David, who would be born post this incident. Now, I think if I'm nailing my moment to the wall, a lot of people at this moment, you can't see me, those of you listening out there, but this will tell you a lot. A lot of people would say, I have so heard this story before. And you roll your eyes and you go, let me tell you the headline. Sheltered white woman, middle class, shocked into reality because she's met an African survivor of conflict. And I think I would definitely roll my eyes too if that was my story, but it wasn't. At the moment that I met Esperance, I had been living and working inside of conflict and post-conflict nations for almost 10 years. Right. Not only on policy, but also just on practical infrastructure creation. So I knew the stories, and everything from Northern Ireland to, Sierra Leone to South Africa.
You had seen awful, terrible things.
I had seen awful, terrible things.
So why this story, this moment?
Why this moment? Esperance, when she told me her story, was so generous, allowed herself to be proximate to me. She placed herself next to me, generously handed me her story. And it was the first time that I, in my 10 years of working in hard places, did not choose one of my 3 normal default mechanisms. And those 3 default mechanisms looked like this. My favorite of all of them was this super high-functioning apathy. It was such a privileged place to dwell. I made myself aware of what was going on. I read, I watched, I listened, but I remained at a place where I could say, I could care, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to know, right? It's very diagnostic. I call it apathy, high-functioning apathy. Apathy is a privileged place. So in the name of making policy, in the name of making right decisions, I allowed myself to understand maybe what was going on with Esperance, but I didn't lean in to feel her pain. The second place that I would go frequently is this self-righteous antipathy, where I would be, I'm angry and I am justified in my anger. And you know what? Don't know, don't care. Whatever you are saying, it isn't going to affect me. And in fact, I'm only going to listen long enough to know that you're wrong. I'm embarrassed to say that, even today I still slip into that. There are triggers for me that make me, that give me that point of, you know what? Don't know, don't care. Not going there. And then the third thing that I would do prior to meeting Esperance, in the middle of saying that I was doing good, is I would choose this kind of therapeutic sympathy that would lie around the edges. It was my quick fix tension release. I would sit in the face of suffering and pick whatever was most culturally appropriate to release me from the tension of that person's suffering as fast as possible. It alleviates guilt, and it could look a lot like the way we do, I'm just going to send flowers to the funeral. I'm going to write the card. I'll make the chicken noodle soup and make sure it gets to them, but I ain't going in there. Sympathy, for me, this kind of therapeutic sympathy, is nothing more than just an acceptable tension release. Honestly, none of these three things, high-functioning apathy, self-righteous antipathy, or therapeutic sympathy, none of these were my moment. None of these changed my life. For 10 years, I rolled around in them. But meeting Esperance and leaning into the pain of her story opened up a whole world that was not only her pain, but her joy, too. Mm-hmm. I understood her life. Only empathy had the power to do that. So encountering a woman who had suffered deeply taught me what leaning into somebody's story is, and I call that empathy.
You just come out with your first book, right?
Yes.
Brave Souls, Experiencing the Audacious Power of Empathy. And you're right, it starts with the story of Esperance. But then understanding what it means to lean into somebody's experience and suffering and what that means for empathy, how did you then take that moment and reflect back on your other experiences? What you had seen in your life up to that point? And then how do you kind of take that moment and apply it to issues of violence against women, human trafficking, all of the terrible things that we work to address?
That's a great question. I think one of the best parts of the story is I was actually in Congo for that particular visit, writing an article for the Daily Beast on Mother's Day in a war zone. And meeting Esperance was part of interviewing a number of women. Esperance was given a story release form. And 1 Million Thumbprints, the organization that I work with, has a very strict policy release, a story release policy. So Esperance sat with the person she indicated as the person she trusts most for a couple of weeks, learning what it would mean for her to release her story. Mm-hmm. I think she got really frustrated because she had the person she was working with, which was her pastor, flip the policy release form over and had him write these words, "Tell the world my story." And because she was pre-literate, the thing that she had that was most valuable to her, the thing that procured UN goods and services for her, the thing that allowed her in her district to vote, the thing that gave her an identity, who she was, her thumbprint. So she inked it up, and she, as her signature, she placed her thumbprint under those words, "Tell the world my story." That was her permission. I received that in an email from the good folks at World Relief. I was their guest on this opportunity to write for the Daily Beast. And when that landed in my inbox, I read it, looked at that thumbprint and thought, okay, this is no longer just a good idea. This is no longer something I can remain clinically aloof from. This is no longer that moment of her story translating into policy.
It's no longer arm's length, it's your thumb.
It was her identity. She generously brought me her story and then gave it to me and said, do something with this. And for whatever mysticism we can bring into that moment, for me, that translated as a white evangelical woman into the voice of God. Belinda, you have just received a mandate from your teacher. Tell this story and figure out what this story means to changing the world, because something's wrong. If women can be systematically raped as a part of the plan in a conflict zone, if breaking a woman is part of the recorded and indicated strategy that a government or a warlord is using to win a war, there's something wrong. What can you do, knowing Esperance's story, translating that into policy, translating that into advocacy, translating that into action? It's your mandate now. This is that moment where I'm like, I was 45 at the time, tooling along, raising children, doing good things, comfortable, but not in my soul. And this was that moment that said, it's time to change. Esperance and empathy changed everything for me. I started an organization called 1 Million Thumbprints, and we began this long journey of reflecting on women's stories, learning to listen to them deeply. And when I say learning, I mean actual learning. There's a science behind listening to, funny enough, not just each other across a desk, but to all kinds of stories. So we set out to make ourselves expert at listening. And then what voices come to us, what stories come to us, we desire to catalyze that voice with the purpose of ending violence against women. In that process, we're hoping funds come to us. We're hoping that as funds come to us, we can use those to build resiliency into programs that can then foster voice for women in strategic places, in conflict zones, like peacemaking tables, like policy tables, like government tables. And in advocating for policy, the full circle is people that hear stories like Esperance can then give their thumbprint, like she did, give a part of their identity in generosity, in empathy, to the process of changing the stuff that's wrong for those women.
So help me understand something, because the term empathy comes up more and more and more these days, right? And in some ways, it's a nice word to say, right? But it's a very, very difficult word to live. So help me understand how you live empathy, and what does it mean in the context of your faith? But what does it mean for somebody who doesn't share your faith?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think Esperance's biggest lesson for me, and now I'm going to say Esperance and Esperances, right? What we need to know is that there are millions of Esperances. I've been challenged by a lot of my sisters of color here in America. Violence against women is broad and spectrum, and the suffering that Esperance experiences is the suffering that millions of Esperances experience here, there, and everywhere. Leaning into those kind of stories require a love. Let's use that generic term, love, because I think in all faiths we have that concept of love. A love strong enough to envision a world today where a sea of refugees are taken care of, where we are convinced that Black Lives Matter, where a child that feels differently on the inside than they are on the outside is accepted and welcomed into their communities, a love for a person who offended you, a love that knows when to speak and when to act, a love that is thick and resilient enough to hold back a war and maybe even soft enough to make way for peace. I know that sounds incredibly rhetorical, but for me, that is empathy. Roman Sarnak, who I consider an empathy guru, defines empathy as the art of imaginatively stepping into the shoes of another person, understanding both their feelings and their perspective, and then using that to guide your actions. That, in my simple brain, equates to a really eloquent equation. Knowing and caring to the point of doing is empathy. I could know Esperance all day long and not care about her. I could care about Esperance and really choose not to know her. Either one of those is going to disconnect me from her, disconnect me from her story, disconnect me from all the stories of all the Esperances. And I will never get to real action. And unfortunately, if I am knowing and not caring, or caring and not knowing, and then acting, my acting can do damage.
So in the U.S. these days, instead of asking the question, are our politics empathetic? Because I think it's like, that's an easy question, right? How do we get our politics and our policymaking to have more empathy?
Oh, that's such a good question. I've been wrestling with that one. In the book, I talk about 3 really practical ways to grow empathy. I hear 2 things all the time when I'm sitting at a dinner table or when I'm in a conference speaking. I can tell when somebody's approaching me loaded for bear, and I know it's going to be one of 2 statements that they make. The first statement is, I don't know, I'm just not a very empathetic person. And the second statement is, don't you know that empathy doesn't make good policy? And I'll tackle the first one first, right? I'm not a very empathetic person. In the book, I argue that that is false. And I tackle it from two perspectives. The first one scientifically, in that empathy is a hard wiring in us. It is on a spectrum, certainly, but some really great study has been done out of the University of Michigan and University of California, where they place us as humanity on empathy spectrums. That means it's more like a muscle than you got it or you don't.
Mm-hmm.
We like to say he's an empathy guru, or she's such a sweet, empathetic person. And that is a minimalistic, reductionistic definition of empathy. Cognitive empathy, the empathy of thinking, and affective empathy, the empathy of feeling, functioning together give us the power to do stuff. Our science tells us that we can develop this in skills. The University of Arizona is doing a great job at developing skills of their students for service. And empathy in knowing and caring about people is the hallmark of their project. So you can grow it. And the way I suggest we grow it in the book is through learning how to do the science of perspective taking. There's skills that we can do. Actually, skills that you can put into practice literally in the next meeting that you take after reading them in the book.
Mm-hmm.
There is empathetic listening, which in my book is a little harder. I like talking. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of, empathetic talking, but empathetic listening is a real thing. Listening to somebody deeply, coupling those two together to actively work towards peace within ourselves and with our brothers and sisters in this world in whom we live. Those are the three hallmark skills that I suggest we can develop like a muscle. That leads to this second question that people come loaded with, right? And that is, well, then empathy doesn't make good policy. And I would suggest that the backbone of that question is wrong. How are you defining empathy then? It was a philosophy professor out of the City University in New York City, his name is Jesse Prinz, who said, I love this quote, "Empathy is prone to biases that render moral judgment potentially harmful." That there's a deep bias inside of us that when we are creating public policy, if we are aligning ourselves with the story of someone and make a policy on that, we will then ignore the other someones that policy might hurt. I understand that argument. It's a misdefinition of empathy. Strictly understanding someone's story or strictly feeling someone's story is going to render deep bias. I'm suggesting that bias is mitigated, or even better, we become aware of our biases when we know and care in the presence of somebody's real, lived, embodied story. Mm-hmm. That's super exciting to me. And going back to your first question, that honestly is the best definition of what happened to me with Esperance. I became aware of what box I had placed her in. And I was about to write an article for a national media outlet that was going to put her in a box. And she so graciously and intelligently showed me her story and asked me to retell it. Mm-hmm. And that made all the difference. Empathy, properly defined and activated empathy, does not decrease our judgment, it increases our judgment.
And I'm kind of fixated on the acknowledgement of bias, right? Because I think you're absolutely right. I think if we are empathetic in our listening, we do a better job of understanding our bias, and therefore we're challenging our biases too.
Mm-hmm. And each other's biases.
Right.
It makes us brave. This gives us an incredible amount of courage to say, hey, you know what? I think I see something here. I'm listening to you. I'm watching you. In fact, I'm even taking your perspective. I'm moving away from my viewpoint and I'm stepping over into your viewpoint and looking through your eyes and going, wait, we're missing something here. Or even more, we're missing someone. And empathy, the ability to see and hear what's missing, who's missing, makes really good policy.
Right.
Because anytime someone's missing from the table, someone's voice, someone's perspective, someone's actions is missing from the table, and we try to build a policy either for those missing people or around those missing people, we've got bad policy, right?
And it doesn't mean that everybody around the table has to agree. Everybody else
Absolutely.
around the table has to agree to hear each other's story.
That's it. Yeah. So I would say antipathy, that self-righteous antipathy requires you to take my perspective, right? It is offended if you don't. Apathy would set itself up as an authority, and in their aloof non-caring, their opinion reigns supreme. You have to take my perspective, and I will not give it up. Sympathy bases all of its perspective on attention release. So let's just do the quickest, easiest thing possible that's pragmatic enough to keep everybody happy or quiet. Let's keep everybody quiet.
Right.
Empathy is the one that's not offended. Empathy is, I've been saying this for a long time, from my faith tradition, calling out to my people saying, okay, hey, evangelicals, I think we're supposed to be the most unoffended people on the planet, really. And it's from that perspective that we should be influencing public policy. It's from that perspective we should be speaking into the common good of everyone.
At our best, we should all be able to sit with that tension,
Yes.
right? And that's really hard to do,
Yes.
especially on things like violence against women. I mean, you name
Oh,
it,
yeah.
right? It's hard to sit with that tension.
Yeah. You know that you're in a really tense business, right? When you try to fundraise for it.
Right.
I'll be really honest. Fundraising for violence against women is the single hardest thing I've ever done, because the minute someone says, so what do you do?
Right.
I am faced with the dilemma of either inviting them into the tension of my story or, dancing around it and marketing.
Right.
And honestly, you can't market this stuff. You can't lean into the tension and you will become a better person.
Yeah.
You have to appeal to both the logic and the soul. That's why the book is called Brave Souls. I feel like empathy is a really soulish kind of place where everything that we are, that for me is represented in Esperanza's thumbprint, has to come to the table. We have to put skin in the game. We have to put soul in the game. We have to put our minds and our bodies in the game, and then good things will happen.
And it will take a long time.
Yes, it will. Right. Oh my gosh. When you jump into the tension, you stay in the tension. Yeah. My favorite moment now, having been doing this for almost 8 years, working in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, and Syria, is when people look at me and they say, oh my gosh, you're still doing that? And then usually the second thing they say is, man, you look really good for doing that. Like I should be gray and hunched.
So are you hopeful about the future?
Oh my gosh, absolutely.
Why?
Because we're talking about these things. And I'm really hopeful for this amazing demographic that seems to be emerging, which is Christian women of faith who are really ready to move beyond oversimplistic or reductionistic discussions of who's not at the table. They're ready to have that really tense, brave conversation about immigration reform. They're really ready to have that conversation about the role of women in leadership, not only in the church, but in our nation. They're really ready to have that conversation about not just stopping violence against women, which should be pretty high on everybody's agenda, but talking about stopping the systems that underlie why violence against women happens.
I had mentioned that I've been very interested in the concept of reconciliation. Yes. And particularly within the faith community, when you look back at history, not even history, just current day, there's a sense of, okay, if I'm not racist, if I'm welcoming, if I care about violence against women, then it'll be fine. There's not an acknowledgement that there are real systemic issues going on. And my sense is that the community, conservatives and moderates, men and women, are starting to realize that there are some systemic issues at play here. Would you agree that that conversation for the first time seems to be bubbling up in a different way?
Yeah. I want to tip my hat to the really hardworking men and women who have been doing this for decades.
Right.
Yourself included, Ali.
I'm not that old.
Well, for years you've been doing this, right? For months at least.
Maybe a week or two. Who knows?
A week or two, right? I find conversation happen at intersections. And we as humans have to decide whether we're ready to reconciliare, right? To bring conciliare, the bringing together, bringing back together of voices, gathering those who aren't at the table so we can hear their voice. That conversation is happening at an intersection right now of certainly choice, but also pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Those of us that don't agree with policies that are being made, that don't agree with tones that are being taken, or even this idea of whether there's hope for the future, are saying, oh no, this feels like a historical moment and it will pass us by. And so at this intersection, we make the choice. Men and women have been saying, make the choice, have the discussion. People are missing. You're hearing one story, you're not hearing the stories.
Mm-hmm.
You are gathering biased data. You are not looking at the underlying collection of data. Use both your head and your heart. Hear both the facts and the story. Use that then to act. They've been calling out for decades, right? And, lighting their hair on fire, metaphorically and realistically, and credit to them, because maybe this is the moment that their sacrifice over the years is now realizing. So as we choose to know and care about not just the one story, but about the stories, I think that their contribution to the conversation, let's say even from the beginning of the abolitionist movement forward, can become part of our history too.
Mm-hmm.
May it be.
Right. So my last question for you.
Mm-hmm.
You know this one is coming.
I knew this one is coming.
This question isn't as fun when people know it's coming. So only in America, ...
I'm secretly hoping I get to be one of those voices that at the front it goes, only in America, only in America, only in America. I want to be one of those voices, but
Then really lean into this.
I'm giving it right now. I am bringing it, brother. All right. I think only in America is empathy the place where we not only know who's missing, not only care about whose voice isn't being heard, but we are willing to go out and find them and bring them to the table. And I want to believe that again for my America. I really do.
For more information on Belinda, visit our website, immigrationforum.org, and while you're there, please consider subscribing to Only in America. Only in America is produced by Regina Medina and Emily Chow. Our sound editor is Joanna Taylor. Kathleen Farrell is the executive producer, and I'm Ali Nurani. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you next week.